Welcome to Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. We're excited about our topic today, which is the survival economy.
Survival economy. We'll say more about that, Will, because from everything I read, the economy appears to be booming. Stock market's up. Joblessness is down. It seems like it's a thriving economy. So,
well, it does, except that anxiety is also up. I was just hearing a radio program about this, and a small business owner was reporting that he's making more money this year, last year too, than he did before, hiring more employees, putting more money into savings. So for him, the economy is good. It's better. Yet, he said his anxiety is higher.
So when you think about that, anybody who's listened to our program in the past knows we make distinctions between, you could say, a surviving state of mind and a thriving state of mind, recognizing that we can vacillate back and forth between the two. In your mind, what is it that creates a thriving state of mind, or a thriving economy, is this the term you used? Why in the midst of thriving are people feeling so much anxiety?
Well, great question, and it's not a simple answer, but for starters, what it is not, clearly, is a lot of money. Because
you mean thriving is not a lot of money?
Yeah.
Right.
This fellow was one, and there are many, and people will say that, money doesn't make you happy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a different metric here for success. And when we talk about the difference between surviving and thriving, we're not talking about more success in the usual way of looking at it. There are other factors besides external achievement clearly relating to loving what you're doing, having nourishing relationships, feeling that you're on track in your life, not selling your soul just to be successful, a whole range of other ways of measuring what we would call thriving versus merely surviving.
So the term that gets used a lot in corporate settings is, you're talking about qualitative metrics.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're saying that, we're talking about the quality of someone's experience. Sometimes those are intangibles. And in our current economic model, our typical way of doing business often, and we translate that into our personal life a lot, is just to measure the quantitative things. How much money, how big the house, how many cars, what kind of car.
Yeah, and this is part of the concept that we're living in an objective reality. That, what we're experiencing is a thing. Whereas in quantum science, and there's a lot of work now that's talking about, in one form or another, what's called the observer effect, which is how you view things changes what you see. The classic example, which is way overused, so I'm going to do it again, glass half full, glass half empty.
Right.
Do we see opportunities, or do we see problems that give us a depressed viewpoint? The way we see things, we call that mindset, makes a difference.
You were talking about something as you were saying some of the different qualities, you could say, or characteristics that might better define a thriving economy. And when we're saying that, when we're using that term, we're not necessarily talking about the large national system.
Right.
We're talking about in our personal lives. And so if you look at the economy, and part of my portfolio, you could say, is relationships and connection and that sense of purpose and those things you talked about, I think one of the things that I've read around, the anxiety economy, for example, is that people feel very much like they're on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And whatever they accumulate, like this gentleman who was speaking, then you worry about keeping it.
Right.
I'm doing good now, but what about next year if there's a downturn? I just had an example of the thriving economy yesterday, where one of our neighbors sent out an email to our little neighborhood and said, hey, we've got these chickens and they're laying more eggs than we can eat, so if anybody would like some eggs, come up and get them. So my wife went up with an empty egg carton and came back with a dozen eggs. But the two interesting things about this exchange was, one, we said, well, we should really give them some money for this. They hadn't mentioned that in their email, was just come and get some eggs. So she took up $5, which we figured was, fair. That's one thing. So voluntary exchanges, which I think are part of the thriving economy, not mandatory. The second thing was She had a great conversation with Lily, the young girl up there. I think she's about 6, who is very proud of these eggs. And, she came back like glowing, my wife, from this exchange, which is very different than going to the grocery store and buying a dozen eggs. So another distinction with the thriving economy is community. We begin to exchange with each other in a way that is more than just monetary.
Well, and even just the sense of support, to know that you're okay. I had a friend call me yesterday and basically say, do you have time? I just need to talk. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know what they needed to talk about, but I could tell from the tone of their request that they were in the middle of working through something, and what they really wanted was somebody to listen.
Yeah.
And just to sit with them and be able to let them sort through the conundrum they were in. And it was almost like, when we finished, the 90 minutes flew by, and we were done, and they had a smile on their face and said, I feel so much better, thank you. And I don't know that I'd really said anything of great value, but just being there and being able to, be a listening post for them. But also the important thing is that they reached out and asked for that help. It was an honor to me to be able to go in and do that, and I think we both walked away, like with the eggs and the little girl and your wife, we both walked away feeling honored, nurtured, that we each mattered.
Well, and the key thing there is that it didn't result in a key action. Like sometimes those conversations do, but most often, in my experience, it's just listening.
Right.
And feeling that you're heard and getting an outside perspective and feeling that what is happening with me matters to another human being. Because often the problem is the person is siloed in their life. They're working, they have their relationships, but there's certain things they don't feel that they can talk to anybody about.
Right.
They're embarrassing, they're confused, because in our survival economy, we're taught that the home run is the thing. You want to beat the sales projections. You want to be promoted. It's all about growth. It's the growth economy, which is supposed to head up forever. Well, in fact, it goes up and then it crashes down. It goes up and it crashes down. But typically we don't learn much from history, except that we don't learn much from history. So in that mindset, when we start to feel ourselves going down, friend on the phone the other day was talking about his deep depression, clinical depression, and how he finally came out of it. But when we start to go down, we feel that there's something wrong. If I'm not eternally happy, if my numbers aren't always going up, there's something wrong. But like your friend reached out to talk with you because they felt you would listen, and you really assured them that everything was all right, correct?
Well, that it was, I think part of it was just realizing that what they were going through was okay, Yeah. Not that it was necessarily easy, mind you, but that it was an assurance that there was support that's there. Yeah. So, we think about the term thriving, and another word you could say that's close to it is maybe flourishing.
Right.
And so I think about 2 places in particular where I saw thriving communities or flourishing communities that didn't have any of the typical metrics we might think of. They were, in both cases, at third world poverty level. Mm-hmm. And what they did have, however, was a resilience, a communal sense of caring for each other, a very open-hearted willingness to invite people in, and a real desire to be in charge of their own destiny.
What a formula for thriving. I mean, I'm just remembering a book I read years ago called The Fourth Turning. And it's a long diatribe about the state of the world and preparedness for, the storm that's brewing environmentally, economically, and health-wise, so forth. The only thing I remember about that book was the last chapter, which was entitled, more or less, What Should You Do? And I turned the page excited after this fairly depressing read to learn, okay, what can I do about all this to be prepared for, problems in the world, personal and global. And what I remember is the number one on the list was find your community. That was number one. It wasn't, invest wisely, store up food, etc. It was know your community. Find the resiliency between who you're living in close proximity with so that you can help each other.
That's fascinating. And I was, as you were saying that, the sense of community, as I mentioned, in both the situations I'm referring to, one in Brazil and one in Africa, were, again, the obvious indicators you'd say was how could these people possibly be thriving? And yet, on the other hand, there was another ingredient I just realized as you were talking about that they both possessed in just great abundance, and that was gratitude.
Yeah, right.
So again, if I'm conditioned to believe that gratitude is a reaction to wealth or well-being, health, all these type of things, then it's conditional, right? What I found with them, I remember this one gentleman who was very crippled up from having worked an extremely hard labor job his entire life. And there wasn't a day that I saw this man that he wasn't smiling and praising God. It was just like, it's such a beautiful day. I just am so grateful to God that I'm here. I love my family so much. And he'd go through this recitation of all the wonderful things in his life, none of which had anything to do with material wealth, but they had to do with this deeper sense of flourishing within himself and his family and his community.
Well, it's ironic that some of the most popular shows, say on Netflix or films, concern very wealthy people who have no gratitude. They're struggling to keep their wealth. There's all kinds of lying and cheating and stealing going on, and it makes for a good story. But I'd say you just hit the nail on the head. What's lacking there, which is present with people who have far less often, is gratitude. I'm remembering a remarkable experience I had years ago when I was working in San Diego in Mexico, going across that very busy border, and I was working for a bank. And so I was one of the super privileged white guys, in the world. And one day I went out on the deck of this very snazzy home we had there, and I looked down, and there was a lot of construction in Tijuana. There always seems to be things going on up and down.
Right.
And there were these workers who I'd noticed laying brick on the house across the road. And I watched them for a while. It was a very hot day, and they were working hard. And I just had this random idea that I'd take a cold beer down to these guys. So I took a beer down and handed it to one of them. He was very grateful, and I went back up to my perch, and I looked out. Here's what I saw. He was splitting the beer to share with his friends. So they were each having half a beer. Of course, I immediately thought, why did I take down 2 beers? But I watched, and one of them was crippled. And he leaned himself up on the wall, sipped on his beer, and began to sing. And he had the voice of an angel. And I stood up there looking down at this guy who had so much less than me, who was so much more grateful than I was. I'll never forget that.
That, and again, it all depends on how we measure, right? That's a beautiful story. And, I think the ability to find ways to be grateful, to find the things we're grateful for, I think we know that it changes our brain chemistry. Right. And, as we say that, I think one of the other characteristics I noticed, I'm thinking of different people I've met in life, to me, who radiate this sense of thriving regardless of their circumstances. And I'm thinking of this one man. He was the spiritual leader of a community, and he had this way about him that when he met somebody, first of all, he just honored them in a real authentic, not a schmarmy kind of a way, but a very authentic way. And he always noticed something about them that was either unique or special or something they brought to the community that he would affirm to them.
He would say something to them about it?
Yeah, very often I'd see him, he'd pulled somebody aside and, he'd be saying, Maria, I loved how you interacted with that young woman just a minute ago. I saw her eyes light up, right? So she was probably modeling him, but what he was doing was affirming to her, and you could see her light up. Yeah. First of all, that somebody caught her doing it right, you could say. That's right. a term we use a lot. But, you think about this idea of gratitude, of a sense of community, realizing it's not a solo job we have here.
Well, you're reminding me of the proof in this field that a specific appreciation is much more impactful than a general one.
Right.
So just to say, well, you're doing a great job, fine. But to do what this gentleman did, where he got very specific, he's doing two things. One, he's appreciating them, but he's also proving that he's noticing them. They're being seen and appreciated for something specific.
Yeah, and we even see that when we're doing employee engagement surveys or 360 surveys where people are rating the person that supervises or leads or manages them, and they will say that in their comments a lot of times. It's nice that you say thanks to all of us as we're going out the door. We appreciate that. But when you catch us doing something specific and comment on it, it means so much more.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's practice what we preach here, Chris, because as some of our listeners may know, we have a 3-part learning system where, we give people data, then we have them imagine what it would be like to apply that data they've just heard or read in their lives, and then we give them a practice. So we're about halfway through the program, giving people a lot of data on the thriving economy versus the surviving economy. I'm wondering if we could invite listeners to think about some area of their life where they're, struggling, where they're in the surviving economy, and invite them to apply what we've been talking about to that specific situation.
Yeah, so let's enumerate just a few areas again so that people have maybe some specifics. One would be to pay attention. What's your community? Find your community, as you said. Another one would be to really catch people doing it right. Another one would be to find things to be grateful for. If we just look at those three.
Yeah, and look at those three, and as you hear Chris remind us of those, think of a specific situation. This is kind of like the appreciation. If it's general, it's fine, but if it's specific, it's much more powerful. So something that you're dealing with, I'm speaking directly to the listeners, some situation that isn't hunky-dory. It's needing something. And what we're suggesting is that right now, you can engineer a mind shift change. And without anything needing to change physically in that situation, you have the power to change how you see it, and particularly to bring in some gratitude. So you might think, okay, having identified this situation, what can I be grateful for? Who can I appreciate in this situation?
Yeah, and it might even be also noticing, who do I have around me that I could reach out to? And sometimes I know certain people where I've been coaching them say, that's the problem. I don't have a community. And so in that conversation, as you're imagining that, rather than looking who might you reach out to receive assistance, ask yourself, who could you reach out to serve?
Yeah, what a difference. This is about being proactive. And this second stage of our learning process is so powerful because in the realm of imagination, there's really no limitations except our reluctance to think outside the box. So right now, you can ask yourself, and these two words are so powerful, what if?
Yeah.
What if this situation that you're imagining could be completely transformed? And as you imagine that, what if, feel how you can proactively flow a different kind of perspective into it. It's a different mindset, a different expectation that is really riding on your viewpoint, seeing it differently.
You know, as you're doing that too, which we do these exercises a lot individually with people, but also in groups, and there's an understandable, you could say, healthy skepticism people have, saying, well, what, so you're going to tell me that suddenly things are going to magically change? Well, what we want to be clear on is we're not saying the circumstances are necessarily going to change right away. They might not even change externally at all, but how we perceive them and experience them is where we're starting at.
Well, exactly. And, you know, we like to give people a practice after we've run through this little imagination thing here. And I want to suggest that a relevant practice here, since we have been talking about the economy, is to begin practicing generosity. And here's an example, and I don't mind sharing it. It's personal. It's a little humbling. Recently, our electrical bill went up because the provider has begun installing smart meters everywhere. And my wife and I didn't want a smart meter. We don't think they're healthy, and so we opted out. Well, in order to opt out, they're charging us $36 more a month, which is sizable. And so I found that as I was writing out the check to the utility company, I'd have this grumbling attitude, like, those bastards, you know. And
I'm paying them $500 more a year just to not have something.
Yeah. And so I stopped and I thought, well, that's, you know, justifiable in the surviving economy where the gold standard is to get more and to give less.
Right.
That's kind of the thinking. So I thought, well, you know, I'm part of this thriving movement. I'm doing these podcasts, writing books, and I better practice what I'm preaching. So what would a new story be? So what would my practice be? Imagining things differently. And it's that and I just did this yesterday, when I write out the check to Pacific Power, I'm very deliberate, and I even write on the check, thank you. Because I appreciate that I can plug in my coffee maker, that I can turn on the blender, that I can get in the hot tub, that I have light to read, that my computer is connected to the internet because of the services they're providing. So that's a practice. How about being grateful for all the services we receive that we usually are unconscious of, or we may even be, like I was, negative about them?
You know, it's as you're saying that, my wife has a blessing on the food that she does regularly that goes along those lines, and part of it is to kind of jump in the middle of it she's saying thank you to all the people and the animals and the vegetables and the minerals and the miracles that went into making this meal.
Yeah.
And part of what she's doing in her mind is trying to really be aware of everything that it took for that meal to be on our plate in front of us, where we actually get to sit in a peaceful dwelling and nurture ourselves. And as I think about that, again, flashing back to Africa in particular, where kids were getting one meal a day, gratefully with the help of, you know, the local grandmothers there, they had figured out how to give them an 1,800 calorie meal. So they were or was it 18,000? I can't remember, but it was enough for them. It was
enough to keep them going.
Keep them going. But it was the same thing every single day, right? And yet, when you'd sit down with these kids as they were eating and you know, share with them, two things I noticed. First of all, it was like they were having Thanksgiving dinner every single day. They were just so grateful for the food and relishing the taste. I mean, it tasted good, but I mean, this was like they were eating manna from heaven. And it was like you were talking about with the construction workers in Mexico. If one of the kids happened to somehow end up with more on his plate, he looked around him and immediately equalized it out. You know, why were they doing that? Because they're a community.
Exactly.
Because they were taking care of each other. Because they were, you know, expressing that gratitude. So a lot of times, I think, like you said, the practice is, how can I put this thriving economy which is a mental framework, really, I think, into practice. And part of it is to simply say, where can I be of service today?
Well, and part of that in relationship is to invite others to be more grateful. I think it's challenging to be in conversation with someone who is very privileged and has a lot, and listening to them complain. What is our tactic when that happens? I'm a polite Canadian, so usually I keep my mouth shut. But lately I've been challenging people. And again, you spoke of your wife. I'll speak of mine. We both have terrific wives. She has this habit of saying, and I don't know if she learned this in an NLP course or what, but if she's listening to somebody complain and they're not grateful at all, she'll just pipe up and she'll say, oh, well, when would now be a good time to change that?
Right, yeah.
And usually
NLP.
they go, what? She says, well, when would now be a good time to change that story? And then if they're curious, she'll elaborate a little bit along the lines of what we're saying, that, that person has a story called complaint. And they could have a story called gratitude. And that phrase, when would now be a good time to change that, is actually kind of inspiring because it encourages a person to be proactive. If I choose to, I could tell a different story right now.
Well, and I think, we all get caught up in the place of losing awareness of maybe that we've fallen off the track, so to speak. And a lot of times, too, what I've found is that when people are complaining, what's really going on is there's a deeper dissatisfaction or unhappiness or pain that's going on in their life, and everything is painful.
Yeah.
That anxiety economy exists because people are, anxious about surviving.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, if we see ourselves as lone wolves, then being anxious is a natural human biological reaction.
Right, whereas if we acknowledge we're in community and begin to grow those deeper connections, we're not so concerned about survival. We've got a fallback. We've got friends who can support us.
Yeah, anybody who's read or seen the version of The Secret Life of Trees understands how connected a forest is, and how they are feeding each other through a microbial network.
Right. Well, they're thriving. Often we use nature as our example. So today on the program, our topic has been the survival economy versus the thriving economy. And we've encouraged listeners to think of some area of their life where they're, in struggle, experiencing survival instead of thriving, and to imagine, what would it be like if I was thriving here, and then to use the practice of expressing gratitude proactively for everything that one's receiving.
A lot of times in a Western economy, we think of thriving purely in monetary terms, or in terms of physical assets that we might have. And really what we're saying here is that that's great. That is one aspect of thriving. Yeah. But the qualitative aspects of our relationships, our community, our sense of purpose, our joy, our gratitude, all of those things are essential elements to really thriving in a really healthy, holistic way.
Yeah, you could say the thriving portfolio is bigger. It isn't just money and investments. It includes all these other things like community, relationships, etc.
Right. So, focus on those. Those are probably things you may even have more direct influence and control over this week. And as you continue to build your thriving portfolio, make sure you share your stories and ideas at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.